Welcome. This is an update on the status of Solar Cycle 25 covering the month of April of 2023. Let's start with a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to discuss the solar cycle amplitude, or what it's likely to be. Then the timing of the next maximum and the following minimum. We're going to take a look at flare and CME rates compared to Solar Cycle 24. And we're going to take a look at emerging regions as a point of comparison as well. As we always do, let's start with sunspot number. This is the daily sunspot number for the month of April according to the SIDC in Belgium. You can see it's highly variable. At some points during the month it was as low as 45, at other points it was nearly 200. Over the month there's been a general increase in the sunspot number, which means the low areas that were present at the beginning of the month are now beginning to fill in with new sunspots. The question remains whether the high areas, as shown here in the middle of the month, will be maintained or increased for the equivalent period in May. This is a plot of the sunspot number shown on various timescales. In yellow we have the daily sunspot number, which is highly variable, going everything from 0 at times to over 200. The blue curve is the monthly average sunspot number, and that takes quite a lot of the variability out, but there's still quite a few peaks and valleys there. And the red curve is the smooth sunspot number, which is an average over the last 13 months of the solar cycle. And that is the one that is used to determine the metrics of a cycle, like when the maximum is and when the minimum is. This is a detailed plot of the smooth sunspot number for Solar Cycle 25 that I just did. You can see that it's a much smoother curve than any of the previous ones, and its peak at the moment is just over 100, but that peak applies to October of 2022. Because the smooth sunspot number is an average of 13 months, we are always 6 or 7 months behind the current date for the determination of the smooth sunspot number, but the fact that it's already over 100 is quite promising. In comparison, the peak of Solar Cycle 24, which occurred in April of 2014, was only 116. And so we have a long way to go in this cycle before we reach its peak. So that's another indicator that we're likely to exceed Solar Cycle 24. Let's try to get into some solar cycle predictions. And there are three main ones that professional astronomers use. There's the so-called standard curve, which is shown here in red, comparing with the smooth sunspot number shown in black and the monthly average sunspot number shown in blue. And you can see that it's predicting that by this time next year, the sunspot number will be around about 190. That's probably the most optimistic of the models. The most pessimistic one is what's called the combined method, which predicts about this time next year will be at about 125. And finally, there's something called the McNish-Lincoln method, which is a pair of researchers that came up with this idea, and they're predicting something like 135. Again, the number that by comparison, Solar Cycle 24 was 116. So all of these models are predicting a cycle that is somewhat larger than Solar Cycle 24. Back in 2009, NASA and NOAA put together a committee to predict the upcoming solar cycle, and their prediction is shown here in red, with the grey area around it being the uncertainty on that prediction. They predicted that Solar Cycle 25 will be slightly larger than Solar Cycle 24 and peak in 2025. The data shown here in little diamonds is actually outperforming their model by quite a significant margin. If this margin is maintained all the way through to maximum, that would predict that the cycle would have 164 as the peak for using sunspot number. There's an alternative method of measuring solar activity, which is the F10.7 centimeter radio flux, that's shown in the bottom panel here, and that is outperforming the model by an even larger margin and predict that we'd have a solar cycle peaking at around about 200. There's another thing that we can predict about the sun, and that's where the sunspots are. Here I've plotted the latitude of the sunspots in the northern hemisphere in orange and the southern hemisphere in blue. And you can see that they've been slowly drifting towards the equator. This is quite usual. They sort of appear around about 25 to 30 degrees and drift slowly towards the equator as the cycle continues. When they reach the equator, that's generally the indicator that the next cycle is going to start. That's when solar minimum is going to be. You can see I've used a least squares fit here to see what the general trend in this data is, and you can then extrapolate that trend to when it will cross zero. So let's do that right now. You can see here under gradients that I've got the two equations that I had on the previous two charts. Now all you've got to do here is determine when they cross zero is to solve those equations for when y equals 0. I've done that here, and for the northern hemisphere it would cross the equator in 119 months from the beginning of solar minimum. In the southern hemisphere it's somewhat longer at 128 months. That would put the minimum respectively in November of 2029 and July of 2030. Now generally from our experience, the hemisphere that is the longest one is the one that determines the date of solar minimum, so July of 2030 is the most likely of these dates. Now an interesting thing is that on average the maximum occurs at 40% of the way through a solar cycle, and so we could use that date to determine when solar maximum will be, and that actually claims that solar maximum will be in April of 2024. Now that's a lot sooner than most of the models are showing, so that would be an interesting thing to check. We can actually use the number of sunspot cycle groups to have a measure of how active the sun is. And you can see here again, solar cycle 25, shown in this burnt orange color, compares very favorably with solar cycle 24. And if that trend were to continue all the way through to maximum, the peak of that cycle would be 134. Now that's a lot lower than some, but it's certainly higher than solar cycle 24. We could actually use other solar activity indicators such as flares, C flares, M flares and X flares independently, and also coronal mass ejection. So let's take a look at those and see what they would predict. Let's first take a look at C flares. Again, solar cycle 25 is shown in orange, solar cycle 24 is shown in blue, and you can see that the number of C flares in solar cycle 25 is vastly outpacing solar cycle 24. In fact, if this difference was continued to reflect in solar maximum, it would indicate that the next solar maximum is going to be 237, which is nearly twice what the previous cycle was. Now let's take a look at M flares, and that actually gives a very similar result to the C flares. Solar cycle 25 is outpacing solar cycle 24 by quite a large margin, and would predict, if that margin were continued to solar maximum, to have a sunspot number of 243 at the peak. X flares are not so useful just because there aren't very many of them. We've only had 16 so far this cycle. By this last cycle we had 12. So 16 and 12 by statistical methods would be basically equivalent to one another. But if you just took the numbers as they stand, solar cycle 25 would have a peak number of 155. But that's not a reliable result. We could do a similar analysis for coronal mass ejections, and here we go to the SOHO coronagraph for the data. Once again, solar cycle 25 is vastly outpacing solar cycle 24, and if that was reflected all the way through to solar maximum, that would put it at 154. What can we conclude from all of this? Certainly for solar cycle 25, all activity indicators are increasing, and they are generally greater than solar cycle 24 by a significant margin. Solar maximum could be anywhere as early as next year or another 3 years away. I think probably the sooner of those is the more likely. The solar cycle 25-26 solar minimum looks like it will be in 2030. And then we'll have to take a look at what's going on then to predict what solar cycle 26 is going to be like. So thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and goodbye.